Hey, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Still have a busy half day planned, so appreciate that. Welcome to day 3 of our first annual OneOncology conference. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I hope all of you enjoyed having it here in Nashville. I'm looking forward to the rest of the presentations. Before I do that, another quick shout out to our sponsors. Appreciated the exhibitors who are here. Appreciate those on my team who've worked hard for this. You get to meet Duncan Allen, who is so responsible for making this successful. The remainder of my clinical team, the marketing team, and then Total Health as well. So thank you for your supporting this year. The next 3 speakers, a panel of people who've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we make CAR T successful, not just as a clinical treatment, but how do you bring it to practice? Most of us understand it's a real issue right now with the amount of access of a therapy that we all think is exciting and is changing medical oncology. And yet, just in the last 3 months, I've had a couple of patients who are great candidates who have proceeded with other therapies because they didn't have access to it. Almost every time I talk with a practice, particularly those who are just joining us, they say, and what is your answer to CAR T therapy and cellular therapy? And so it's great to hear that that there are ways to increase access, and that's definitely bringing it out to the community. So I wanted to invite Dr. Madan Jagasia, Executive Vice President of Medical Affairs at Iovance Biotherapeutics. Madan, I've known for almost 20 years and always had this great insight, and we've talked about this, is that that original medical oncologist, the treating physician, remains the physician, and that we have to keep that focus, and that we're the ones tied to the patients, and I always really appreciated that, Madan. Duncan Allen, Senior Vice President at OneOncology, helps execute and it has really helped me keep the focus on how we're going to expand additional services across OneOncology. And finally, Chris Garabedian, Chairman and CEO of Xontogeny, and so wanted to appreciate all of you coming today and speak. I'm going to leave it over, I think, for your discussion. So if you 3 will come up, thank you.
So I think we're on day 3 here, so appreciate you all staying with us, and I'm sure everybody's ready to get home and watch the season premiere Yellowstone, so we won't get in your way. So today I have Dr. Jagasia and Chris Garabedian with me. I'd like to just have them do maybe just a quick little intro on what your company does, and give us a little bit of background on how you play a role in the cellular therapy community. So Madan, maybe we start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Duncan, for the invitation, and thank you for being here on a Sunday morning. So Madan Jagasia, just a little bit of a background. Practicing hematologist, oncologist for almost 25 years, cell therapy, was the medical director of the transplant program at Vanderbilt, and then the CMO of the cancer center at Vanderbilt, before I transitioned to industry and the executive vice president at Iovance, which is a global leader in tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte cell therapy. In fact, just a couple of days ago at the SITC conference, we presented our pivotal data. We've started our BLA submission with the FDA and hope to get the first cell therapy for solid tumor and metastatic melanoma to the market. So over to you, Chris.
Great. Yeah, Chris Garabedian. So currently I'm on the investor side and doing early stage investments. Santogeny is kind of a seed investment collaborative model. But I also work as part of a larger investment firm called Perceptive Advisors, which over the last 10 years has been probably the most active crossover investor, meaning they take companies public. And so they've been active investors across cell therapy, across cancer broadly. And before I became on the investor side, I was on the operating side as a biotech executive. So I was CEO of a genetic technology and rare disease company. Before that, I was at Cellular as head of corporate strategy. Before that, I had a variety of roles at Gilead. Now, both of those Gilead and Cellular roles were before they acquired Kite and Juno, but have followed the cell therapy space closely. Glad to be here.
It's really, really exciting to hear about, and it sounds like you both, in some ways, have had the inside track on the space. So this will be really interesting to hear. You know, this is not something that we really eat, sleep, and breathe every day, and so you all do. Give us an understanding of why has this been so revolutionary? Why is CAR T so revolutionary? Maybe Madan, we start with you.
Sure, absolutely. So just a little bit of a historical context. the first observation that immune system can kill cancer was actually made in the late 1800s when a patient with metastatic sarcoma was admitted to a hospital in New York City under the care of a physician, and the patient had streptococcal sepsis, and the sarcoma went into remission. That was the first observation that an activated T cell can kill cancer. So fast forward, Nobel Prize from Jim Allison, checkpoint biology, fast forward to the work of Carl June, Steve Rosenberg. Essentially what's happened is you can take a T cell, imagine a T cell as a payload that has all the ingredients to attack a cell. And you can direct the T cell to attack any cell that you desire. The molecular technology is so advanced today. So these days, the limiting factor is not the T cell, it's actually the target on the cancer cell. So once you have a differential target, i.e. CD19 for lymphoma, BCMA for myeloma, you can take a T cell and tell the T cell to attack that cancer cell. And you can make a T cell behave any way you want. You can re-engineer the domains underlying the T cell receptor. And that's where all the differences in the products come in, whether you get cytokine release syndrome, at what day, how much neurotoxicity. And just think about it at a higher level, right? If you can do that to a T cell, you can do that to an NK cell. So NK cell therapy is coming up. From an Iovance standpoint, the way we're approaching it is we basically take a tumor, and the immune system's really smart. So the minute the first cancer cell is born, the body senses it and sends the immune cells right there. That immune cell is called tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte. So the TIL has already achieved a few things. It's recognized cancer, and it's reached the cancer environment. Unfortunately, the cancer cells are smart, and they outsmart the TIL. But if you take the tumor out and you amplify the TILs, you release it from the immunosuppressive environment, you now have a drug product. And when you give that drug product back to the patient after some lymphodepletion, so for example, in metastatic melanoma, in the post-PD-1 setting, there's an unmet need. These patients live an average of around 7 to 8 months today. We've basically shown that you've got a 31% response rate across 153 patients. The median duration of response is not reached, and a subset of patients are functionally cured. Rosenberg has shown that patients who achieve a CR after TIL cell therapy and who are alive at the 2-year mark, their melanoma-specific survival at 10 years is 97%. That's the power of cell therapy. And there are trials going on in cervical cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, every cancer you can think about. If you have a target, you can make a cell therapy. So as these cell therapies sort of come to market, and they've sort of been the forte of academic centers, and the question we'll obviously get into is, where does this fit into the community landscape? Because most patients medically eligible for CD19 CAR T cell today in North America are not treated with CAR T cell.
Amazing. And Chris, from your perspective as an investor, what's the revolution been like, for you?
Well, in biotech, things generally go very slow. So when you have a new technology area, there's a lot of skepticism, because in our industry, 90% of things that are brought into the clinic fail to achieve FDA approval. 99% of things that look good in a rodent model fail to get FDA approval. So we're conditioned and used to new technology areas not working quickly and taking a long time. Now, what was interesting about autologous CAR T, if you look at Kite and you look at the time from inception as a company to approval of a new technology platform, that was pretty fast. And I think you had this wave of exuberance. And I have to say, if you look at the Kite and Juno acquisitions as an example, it's really hard to justify the price of $9 billion and $12 billion that they paid for that. But what they saw was that this is the footing of a platform that's going to be around for a while. And so when you get reputable companies stepping up, right, and saying, hey, we think this is part of the future, with all of the question marks around, is it going to go allogeneic? Are you going to see other novel cell therapies evolve? I think usually the companies that bet on the first movers usually are right because it takes a while for these other technologies to catch up and to make a dent. We're seeing that this year in that the revenue bases, we're close to $3 billion now, right? And it's growing, and you've got multiple drugs approved. So once people see a line of sight that, okay, we understand what it takes to get these approved. And again, at Celgene, Madan and I were just talking about this. A company can drive tens of billions of dollars of value, or even 100 billions of value, on dominating one indication. Multiple myeloma was the big driver. So I think what you see in both multiple myeloma and lymphomas is that those are good enough on their own to look at the innovation, and that's just scratching the surface on where else this can go.
Sure. So speaking of which, I think it's obvious that the top of the funnel, there's a lot of activity, right? But when you get down to those viable products, how viable are they? When you look at sort of CAR T, Madan, maybe this is a question for you. When you look at CAR T as a long term on the long haul, how do you think about the viability of it?
I think we are 5 years after the first CAR T approval right now, and if you look at the revenue of Kite related to Yescarta, it continues to grow, right? They've gone from continent to continent, expanded their manufacturing capability, new manufacturing plants. So I think the long term is looking really bullish, right? I think it's about adopting this at the end of the day, making sure patients have access to it. And I think if you can, for the physicians in the audience, you can think about when Ipi/Nivo was coming out to the community. It was dreaded, right? Will we be able to manage the colitis, the pneumonitis? And now when I speak with academic physicians, they rarely see an untreated melanoma or a non-small cell in academia because everybody's got their checkpoint in the community. So I think we have to think about it. I would guarantee that within the next 5 to 7 years, CRS and neurotoxicity will be treated more in the community than in academia. It will get normalized. In medicine, it's always happened that way.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm curious to hear from your perspective, having been in academia, now being in industry, why does it seem like all of the administration's been done only in academia, and why is that?
I think, again, it's a historical context, right? Stem cell transplant, bone marrow transplant, which is complex, multidisciplinary, large infrastructure, was a forte of academia. And CAR T-cell clinical trials started over there, and they just kind of kept it over there. I sincerely believe that you can leapfrog in the community. You don't have to build big transplant programs to do CAR T-cells. You can basically select your CD19 product of choice, select your BCMA CAR T-cell, take 2 products, and launch in the community. Recently, a bispecific engager got FDA approved. So are we now going to say that we're not going to give a bispecific in the community just because it has CRS and neurotoxicity? So CRS and neurotoxicity cannot be the limiting factor. People have to learn how to sort of deal with it. New workflows have to be done. Some of the senior physicians have to learn new tricks, and also keep in mind that the junior physicians who are coming into the community, it's very common for a hem-onc fellow today who's getting trained in academia to routinely see CRS and neurotoxicity during training, right?
So you think, practically speaking, you think that this can be brought into the community?
Absolutely. I'm 100% confident that this can be brought into the community.
Okay. And Chris, anything else to add?
No, I mean, if it's okay, I'll just share some statistics for the audience in terms of how this is going to grow. This is partly about the future, and I wonder if driving the future of oncology was related to the cars, the potential for the cars. But so
of course it is.
Overall, 180 companies or so are focused on cell therapy and kind of the future and moving beyond the drugs that are approved today. If you look at those 180 companies, they drive about 650 programs. Now, of those 180 companies, about 60% are private and about 40% are public, and that shows you the exuberance around public investors to bet on the future in this particular space. Of the 650 programs or so, almost 60% are T-cell specific, so building on the current approved drugs. Of the others, you have about 23% NK cell focused, about 6% Treg focused, about 5% gamma delta cell, and then others include the TILs, other macrophage, autocell vaccines, dendritic cells, et cetera. And then just to highlight further, the areas that are of the key focus, if you were to break down all of these companies, what is their differentiator? Probably the largest group is increasing solid tumor trafficking and infiltration. Next, you have kind of alternative cell immunotherapies. These are the NK or Treg, TCR, B cell therapies. The next is probably allogeneic therapies. Another category, multiple antigens, neoantigens, and novel CAR receptor design is a big area. And then you've got overcoming the tumor microenvironment is how some of these companies would be positioned, and then controlling expansion and persistence. And a growing area of interest, although it's a smaller universe, is the in vivo CAR category. So that just gives you a sense of the scale. And one of the things, I think it might have been one of the slides that were shown, is that we've really seen this grow significantly over the last few years. Now, the biotech sector has gone through a tough year, and so you're going to see less investment in 2022. But 2019, 2020, 2021, there was so much money raised around these strategies that it should give enough runway to see these programs advance over the next couple of years.
Yeah, and if I may add, there's an initiative out of MIT called the MIT Nudix Program, and they try to project how many FDA-approved cell therapy products are going to be in the market. The projection, if I'm not mistaken, is that by 2035, there might be upwards of 30 to 35 cell therapy products that may be FDA-approved. And this goes to say, right, the investments that were made in 2019 through 21, there was so much dollars invested that should allow that momentum. So think about it, right, from a community perspective, 30 to 35 products that you don't want an opportunity to give in the community, and all those are the patients that are going to, and academia is also saturated, right? If you look at the Garabedian launch, right, most academic centers say that they have waiting lists of patients. They just can't process them fast enough. So I think it's going to reach an inflection point sooner or later where this has to spill over into the community.
And that's a great point. I mean, I think we've seen this before, right, in our prior lives, where patients do sit on waiting lists, and there's some real challenges and barriers. It's great that we've obviously established there's a healthy ecosystem here, great investment going into the space. There's some promising therapies really coming out of it. That's crazy to think 35 therapies. That's overwhelming. But yet today, for a patient, their insurance may not necessarily approve it. So is that changed? Yeah, I know when things were first getting off the ground, what is the current state of these barriers and challenges we face?
Yeah, I think from an industry perspective, I can say that industry is doing a very responsible job of preemptively talking to the payers to ensure that upwards of 70 to 80% of covered lives discussions are mature, they've happened. I don't believe that, at least today for CD19 and BCMA CAR, that the access is because of lack of insurance coverage. I think the access issue is because patients either do not want to go to academia because often centers are 3 and 4 hours away, or community physicians still need to get educated to say that this is probably the best therapy for my patient. And it's very analogous to the world of stem cell transplant, right? Relapsed lymphoma for an eligible patient was equal to an autologous stem cell transplant.
Sure.
Right? Today, relapsed lymphoma equals CD19 CAR T cell. So the referrals should happen. Now, it's very likely that patients do not want to travel, and I don't blame them.
Yeah.
Right? Just getting to relapsed lymphoma, they've undergone so many hospital visits, so many physician visits, encountered so many sort of logistical and emotional setbacks that yet again to do this Herculean effort and go to cell therapy, they might say enough is enough. So I think for that patient, getting the therapy locally at home or at least within 2 hours driving distance is really ideal.
Right, and we know in rural communities, right, patients cannot afford to drive more than 2 counties. And so to think that they're going to drive, 5, 6, 7 counties away, it's just not realistic. So I think if we feel like it's practical to provide it in the community, that it's almost something we have to do. It's an imperative.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. Our industry gets a lot of criticism around cost, but I think you hit exactly on it, Madan. So $400,000, let's say on average for a CAR T. I mean, this is analogous to a stem cell transplant. And so when you look at how it's delivered, a new technology area, the cost and expense of delivering that, right, to the patient, that is something that has not caused a kind of controversy that a small molecule prescription that you pick up at the local pharmacy is, $150,000, right? And so I think that there isn't a resistance. I think it really is about access. How do you get more patients into the mix? Now, at some point, right, payers might say, wow, this is, at a few $1 billion, that's not enough on their radar to cause major concern, writ large. But as that grows into 10 billion plus, 20 billion, that's when they're going to start paying attention and really look at the cost structure around this.
Yeah, and I do think the price tag itself, right, is overwhelming, just because it's a bulk price, right? And I think that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, has that been something that has sort of changed the psychology? It seems to me it has changed the psychology of groups like, CMS, Medicare. It's been interesting to watch how they initially reacted and how long it took for them to adopt a lot of the current reimbursement environment we see now.
So I would say that CMS, obviously, when CAR T cells were coming out, it was new for everyone. It was new for the industry. It was new for CMS, new for commercial payers. But I think CMS is also becoming more adept. In fact, from an Iovance perspective, Lifileucel, which is a lead product, it's still not FDA approved, but it's already mapped to DRG 18 in the IPPS 21 ruling. So CMS is also thinking, they know that cell therapy has arrived. Even they realize they have to adapt. Now, CMS payments are never going to be margin generating, but that's true of all CMS rates, right? But I think the commercial payers, and if you look at the data transparency database, the price transparency databases, you can easily impute that practices are making a very healthy margin on cell therapy. A couple of things I would point on cell therapy is that there are products that can be delivered reliably 70 to 80% of the time in the outpatient setting. You still need a relationship with the hospital for those unplanned admissions, but that wave has started. I think that's one thing to keep in mind. 2 is the manufacturing time, right? The CAR T cells have a 17 to 18 day manufacturing time. There's a product from an industry partner where it's in clinical trial, but the concept that you need to grow CAR T cells in the lab is being challenged. You can make the construct in the lab in 24 to 48 hours, infuse it into the patient, and use the patient's body as the bioreactor. So the manufacturing time could potentially get compressed down to a few days. So that's a new wave that has started, because initially the thought was you make a CAR T cell and you need X amount of cells. Well, the X amount of cells can be grown in the body.
Amazing. Chris, anything to add? I think we're going to probably get to questions here.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would just say from the investor side, there has been increasing skepticism because you can see the number of programs and companies that I just spoke of. Everybody wants to see that initial clinical proof of concept, right? Then people are ready to rush in and push that along to approval. I think there's been increasing skepticism of the predictive power and translatability of preclinical data. So I think that's important that companies think about, and this is less so an issue for pharma or big biotech that has big balance sheets, but when you're talking about innovative biotech, they just have to be very lean, very outsourced, very collaborative in working with various institutions to get that proof of concept into the clinic. Because for every 100 programs, it's the 10 that have some interesting clinical data that are going to get all of the other investors to push that through to ultimately approval.
Thank you. Davey, any questions from the audience?
None virtually, but Dr. Garabedian, let me come over to you. I can just repeat it after you. Oh, there we go.
I'm going to be the grumpy. I'm going to be the grumpy guy in the back of the room. To say that 97% of patients who are eligible aren't getting them is true. But the strategy that's approached here, we can't afford this therapy as you have priced it. We cannot as a country. You can say, well, it's cheaper than doing an auto. That's true. We're going to replace all the Keytruda and everything else with these aggressive therapies. I understand the importance of the investor community driving this process by funding and seeking winners, and that part's great. But we can't afford the system we have today. And you are choosing a path that we will never be able to afford. And unless you look at what the pharma community has done to funding today for our patients, this is not sustainable or viable. And we're going to end up in a ration situation. Most of us think we're already there.
Yeah, so I'll make some comments. So first of all, I work in the area that by design, I chose to not have to deal with all of the issues that you speak of. So we are really focused on investing in early stage programs, proof of concept, where none of the companies we invest in, we need to decide what's the price going to be. Having said that, and having been in industry previously, this is one of those areas where there needs to be a margin. The margins are not as healthy as some of these other modalities, whether it be oral small molecules, antibodies, et cetera. And I think that there is going to be competition. So there are companies that, as this gets more competitive, now what's interesting, if any of you follow the industry news, there was a company called EQRX. Their whole business model was focused on, hey, we can follow with just as good of drugs and undercut the price. They just changed that strategy. Some people think it was a little dubious, but they just said, you know, we've changed our whole business model. We're no longer going to focus on less expensive therapies in the market. So that kind of shocked. The stock went down, actually. But I think that competition will try to figure out if they have comparable efficacy and they can deliver, and maybe that's through better distribution, better manufacturing efficiencies, where they can still make a margin and not charge as much. They're going to take advantage of that, and guess what? The payers are going to want to see that as well. So the payers are going to be sensitive. But you're right. I think part of the issue, if we followed the Inflation Reduction Act as an example, where now there's a disincentive to do that at launch. Now more companies are going to say we need to price very aggressively at launch because now we need to renegotiate those down later on. So I think these are valid points, but it comes with the investors really need to feel that there's going to be a return on that investment with all the failure rates that we have.
Don, any comments?
David Shi.
Yeah, thanks. So just curious, like you mentioned earlier, things that we take in the lab, manipulate in the lab, things that we see in vitro, in vivo may not correspond to patient, outcome, et cetera. So, taking T cells, manipulating them, putting them back in the patient. And if I remember correctly, the FDA says something to approve CAR T therapy, you need a potency assay to make sure what we're putting back in the patient's T cell is actually going to work instead of a scientific experiment. So I'm just curious, your thoughts on, how we're going to ensure that T cells that we manipulate in the lab will actually work in the patient.
Yeah, I can take that. Potency assay has been, at least from an Iovance perspective, a very hot topic for the last couple of years for us. So just a couple of things. So the FDA says that prove to us beyond doubt that the cell product that you have manufactured can do what it is intended to do in the patient's body. Potency does not equal efficacy, because efficacy is determined by the patient's genetics, the microenvironment, and a whole host of other factors. I think a lot depends upon the cell therapy product that you're making. So for example, for a CD19 CAR, in the lab, you can show that a CD19 CAR can attack a B cell that is CD19. For tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte, we don't know the neoantigen that's attacking, so you can't create an assay based on that. But as Iovance has declared in a press release, we do have a co-culture assay, so that's proprietary how we've designed it. But there are ways to convince the FDA that the cells that you have made follow the mechanism of action that you've hypothesized. So there's always a way to sort of walk that fine line. And we are pretty confident that when cell therapy comes to market, most industry partners would have figured out the potency assay. That's become a very important and a critical topic, and the FDA is spending a lot of time thinking about it as the cell therapy products become more and more complicated.
Lasika?
Yeah, so for those who are bringing this to the community, what are the steps about the FACT accreditation? And have you done any onboarding of community sites for this?
Absolutely. So I can take that. So again, let me answer the question from two perspectives. One is from an Iovance perspective. We are working with select centers, large centers in the community, and we are doing what we call an evaluation and gap analysis to see if they have the infrastructure to do that. There are successful models of community, tertiary, quaternary community cancer centers that are FACT accredited, so that's not new. FACT accreditation is absolutely feasible for a community cancer center. Now, I'm not saying that it is going to be doable in all centers. I think it needs a denominator of X number of patients where it's worth all the administrative hurdles to kind of get the center through that. But FACT accreditation is absolutely feasible. While I was directing the program at Vanderbilt, I took the program through 3 FACT accreditations, and I think it's absolutely possible.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Madan, Chris, this has been a great pleasure, and I really appreciate you all being here today. I think it's really promising to hear about these therapies and that we can do this in the community. So appreciate you both being here, and hope everyone has a wonderful weekend.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.